welcome to the Taproot Therapy Collective podcast, Discover, Heal, Grow. I'm here with Corey Gamberg, who's the executive director of the Rockland Recovery Treatment Centers. And we're going to talk about some ways that depth psychology and some of the more experiential and somatic medicine overlaps with 12-step and drug alcohol recovery. Corey, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
So can you tell me a little bit about your role in Rockland? I've seen your stuff on LinkedIn. I've enjoyed some of the things that you've posted. You're coming from a similar perspective to us at Taproot, the same stuff we talk about on our podcast. So I'd really like to hear from you how you do that work and what that looks like.
Yeah. Thanks for responding to some of the posts. Some of it's a little daunting to post, I think.
I love it. I was like,
come off the wrong way for people sometimes, but
you got to get over that, man.
Yeah.
You got to get over that and just throw it out there. And if you build it, they will come.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of good feedback within Rockland. So I'm the executive director of the Rockland Recovery Group. So I kind of oversee multiple outpatient facilities that we have. We operate substance abuse and mental health treatment centers in Massachusetts. And I think over the course of the last 5 years or so, it's been a mission of ours at that company to try to be on the cutting edge of substance abuse treatment, of kind of what's coming next. I'm a big believer that, just to jump right into the Jungian stuff, like as far as individuation goes, everything individuates, so as a person moves through individuation, so does phenomena. So, the experience of addiction itself individuates, the experience of recovery itself individuates. And, you can kind of see that a lot of the example that I use for a lot of people is, I'm a drug addict who comes from the Oxycontin era of drug addicts. And that's not really something that we see as much today as we did 15 years ago. Heroin and fentanyl are very different. In my area, at the very least, the increase in people using different drugs like methamphetamine has increased. And that's become something that 10 years ago you didn't see as much. So addiction is changing and the landscape is changing. And with that, we need to find new ways to meet that for recovery. And that's a big part of the work that we're trying to do at Rockland, where to from here sort of thing.
Yeah. Can you say that? Because a lot of like what I wanted to do, it's interesting, like you never really lose the bad reputation from the people who are wanting to kind of criticize you for being forward thinking, even when research catches up with what you're doing.
Sure.
But when we opened, which was not that long ago, I mean, it was 5 years ago, people kind of acted like I was crazy for doing brain spotting. Now brain spotting is like almost kind of ubiquitous in our area. Even the EMDR practitioners have kind of switched over. But I'm seeing kind of the eating disorder world and the treatment resistant trauma world and the addiction and recovery world change a lot and blow up. And that doesn't necessarily mean that 12-step is discarded or gotten rid of. It just means that we have kind of new brain-based medicines, new understanding of neurology, new understanding of cultural and anthropological metaphors that need to come into this thing to keep it alive, to keep it relevant. Could you say some things about what you're seeing about where the industry was that wasn't great, where the industry is going now, and maybe what the future of that looks like as, because, when you're a part of a business, part of that is staying relevant and meeting the need of what's happening. You can't rest on your laurels, and it looks like you're very forward thinking in what you do. Could you kind of talk about some of the strengths, weaknesses of how we do that in America and the profit motive of healthcare?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've worked in treatment in one position or another probably since 2011 or so. And in that time as well, I've been a part of starting some nonprofits that, assist family members through the experience of addiction. So I've seen a lot. I think my experience has always been, as a person in treatment, as a person working in treatment, has always been faced with, traditional 12-step approaches, evidence-based practice, CBT, DBT, and that was kind of the bread and butter. To your point, over years, EMDR and different sorts of modalities have come into play. I think something that's really big right now is the IFS modality. I think a lot of people are taking to that. And interestingly enough, that's just, in my opinion, depth psychology with clinical language. And So it's interesting to see as far as the question of where are we going. It's evident to me that we're going to a place that has more depth. We're not responding to kind of surface level. Let's
Yep.
polish this up and get through this and move on. We're not responding to that anymore as a collective.
Do you
You know,
think that the cognitive and behavioral implications of like behavior is all that's relevant? So as long as you're not doing drugs, you're good. As long as you're going to church, you're good. As long as you're lifting weights in the morning, you're good. As long as you're eating your broccoli, you're good. But not looking at how old is that part of you that wants to use, or how old is that part of you that doesn't feel understood? Where does it come from? Where is it in the body?
yeah.
Do you view those like earlier kind of CBT take or attempts to fuse the 12 step with CBT as sort of avoidant, for the lack of a better word, avoidant of a more whole or more threatening psychology to our system?
I probably would,
Yeah.
I probably would. I think that even now, I think that, and this is a big part of the work that I'm doing on a personal level, recovery just has to be more than that. Recovery just has to be more than the cessation of symptom and the change in behavior and not using, because as someone in recovery for so long, obviously I've seen a lot of people who, do that sort of thing, like go to church, go to the meetings, they live that way of life, but they're still struggling with all these underlying, more deeply rooted issues that just changing behavior doesn't touch. And then
Yeah.
to that point, I think that then immediately a relapse or some sort of behavioral regression is immediately seen as a failure. And in
Mm.
that mindset, it just creates this very shame-based recovery world, I think.
Yeah.
Um, and again, just to kind of go back to that previous question, I think we came from a place where it was much like that, grounded in changing your behavior, just don't use. And now we're moving to this experience where I see people in their early 20s and you can't really speak to them from that sort of 12-step mountaintop, this sort of idea of sit down and shut up and this is what you're going to do. This generation, this new generation of people suffering from addiction, it's just not responding to that because they're longing for something deeper.
Yeah.
And this even happened within my community where I would say Jung probably was a very unknown figure, minus his mention in the big book and some people's knowledge
Yeah.
of him. But
He was the only
Jung,
one that responded to Bill W.
yeah,
Like, I mean, Bill W. wrote 7 people. And Freud didn't write him back. Jung was the one who kind of gave
talk
him the
about you
time.
talk about Roland Hazard.
Sorry.
So the story with Jung and AA, his story starts with this guy Roland Hazard, and he writes to Freud and he writes to Adler, and those
Mhm.
guys they don't respond to him at all. And Jung is the last.
Hey, Corey. I think the video's frozen. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Oh dear. Okay, technical difficulties. We will try and reconnect and go from there. Hey, Corey, I lost you for a minute and you froze and I lost audio. Can you hear me?
Sorry, man. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I'm so sorry. Let me, we'll just keep recording and then I'll fuse those together. If you want to just kind of go from he writes Adler. I think that's the
Yeah.
last thing that I got. I apologize.
Yes. No problem, dude. So yeah, this guy Roland Hazard, he writes Freud, he writes Adler, and they both, don't respond. And Jung is the last one he writes, and Jung is the only one who responds, and he says, "Okay, man, if you can come out to Zurich, that's cool. I'll work with you." And they work with each other for a year, and the story goes is that as soon as he left Zurich and got on the train, he was drunk, and he calls Jung back, or he contacts Jung, and there's this real humbling moment on Jung's part where he goes, "Okay, well, I kind of misdiagnosed you. I thought you were a hard drinker, but you're what people call a real alcoholic. And the only thing that's going to help you is some sort of spiritual experience or spiritual transformation, essentially. So go home and find that." And
Is that the
Roland,
letter where he says spiritus ex spiritum, the replace spirits with spirit?
no, that's the letter he writes to Bill W.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
that's probably 10 years past this story when that letter
Oh,
actually gets written. Yeah.
that's the one
And
I'm familiar with. So I don't know the Roland Hazard stuff.
Yeah, Roland Hazard is kind of the guy who really helps the AA become AA, because he comes back to the States. He joins the Oxford group, which is kind of its precursor. He gets sober through the Oxford group practices. He meets Ebby Thatcher, who's Bill W.'s best friend. Ebby Thatcher meets Bill W., and the story goes. But, without Jung, we really don't have this idea that, spirituality or some sort of spiritual experience is the answer or one of the solutions for addiction. So it's just interesting that a lot of people aren't familiar with him or weren't familiar with him in the community that I was in. And then over the last probably 7 or 8 years, um, he's become prominent in a multitude of ways, not only in the recovery communities, I think, but also in the collective, which really speaks to something of greater depth as well. So to that point of, when you're forward thinking, people kind of think you're crazy, but then eventually they catch on. That's kind of what happened with Jung. And even when we opened Rockland and we started, talking about Jung, it wasn't something that even clients who were coming in for treatment were really familiar with. And it's introducing people to, an entirely different perspective and way to move about psychological life.
And to jump in some of the hard questions of AA, or some of the sticking points people have with it, when you say spiritual experience, I mean, do you mean that I have to see an angel? Do you mean that I have to go to church? Do you mean I have to make contact with a deep part of myself I don't understand? What do you mean there? That spirituality is essential for recovery. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it means so many different things to so many people. And beyond like spiritual experience, I really like what AA's text says about, the psychic change and taking that from a psychological point of view and breaking it down etymologically. We're looking for a soul perspective, a soul transformation. So the way that I see the world. So to me, a spiritual experience is when something happens to me that has happened so many times, yet I can experience it perspectively and embody it in a totally different way. I don't react in my old behavior. I don't react in my old thinking. I'm able to see something happening to me and respond in a completely different way that allows me to find more meaning in that experience versus some sort of resolution to it. And I think that's something that's really hard for people in the treatment world to understand when they work with people, is how to hold space for clients versus needing to offer them some sort of resolution to what they're bringing up. Because a lot of times it's just about putting some voice to the experience and getting some distance and perspective on it that shifts the way you relate to it.
Yeah, I talk about like why a lot of the stuff that is brain based works. IFS is probably the most well known kind of repackaging of some of those things.
Yeah.
But I think the trick is the metacognition, that these parts of self feel like they are possession, like they're all of us, like they take over, whether or
Mm-hmm.
not we admit that that's happening, that's what's happening. And then repressing them through a cognitive or behavioral intervention or more avoidant intervention, you just white knuckle it through life until you never, even if you make it, to the end of your life, and that thing never does flare up and make you deal with the shadow or make you relapse. You're still taking that energy and avoiding it in a way that I think does damage. And what the metacognitive parts do is they let you experience that without being overwhelmed by it, without even having to identify with it directly. You can have sympathy without over identification.
Yep.
And that those networks in the brain are at tension. They are at odds, but we need all of them. And
Yeah.
what these are doing are letting us know those parts of self without them possessing us, essentially.
Yeah. 100%. I agree with that. Yeah.
And it's interesting because IFS is growing. Like I saw that you had done some training at the Chicago Jungian Institute,
Yeah.
which is probably where 50% of our web hits come from. If I
Oh,
look at
wow.
my
Nice.
website, yeah, which is even though we're in Alabama, yeah, that in New York is like half, a couple thousand a month. But people get angry with me for saying that I like IFS, but that if you're going to do individual therapy, it may not be the best way to go to sink $15,000 into that, because what Schwartz is doing, a lot of that is putting Jung and the
Mhm.
post Jungians together with Fritz Perls, the experiential stuff. And people will send me hate mail about that, and I'm like, man, this is in the introduction of his book. Like, I haven't even gotten to the controversial stuff yet. Like, he's telling you, like, this is him. But
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I see it as like a model that takes a lot of these perennial philosophy and then trains people to do it in facilities quickly, with a universalized language, but without the amount of work that it takes to kind of learn a lot of these things that take, 7 to 2 years to learn some of the time. I don't know if you could speak to that when you're saying like where the industry's going and kind of what's getting popular and why.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to me, working with an individual in treatment or someone who's pursuing, recovery or substance abuse treatment, it's a journey, man, and it's an unfolding, and to work with them, it can't be something quick. We can't do a quick fix. We have to take the time. I'm a very psychoanalytic thinker, so therapy is about sort of the retelling of my story, and I think that that's the area that we need to move the industry in, is bringing people in to see that their struggle with addiction or their struggle with alcoholism is not some sort of moral failing. It is not something that makes them different from another person. It's a soul event. Addiction is this sort of Promethean rupture in the psyche, this desire to transcend and grab that fire and also feel divine in myself, to Jung's point. So I think that, working with people one-on-one needs to, for the industry to really progress and survive and be useful in a big way, it needs to understand that the process is not a 30-day thing. It's not a 60-day thing that you might
But the
spend.
research says that the recovery, could you speak to people that are thinking whatever what comes after that, ellipses?
Yeah,
Usually the clinical psychology grad school student that has just taken their research 101 or 201 class and sends me hate mail. Could you
yeah,
tell them why that research is maybe not relevant as somebody who, is an executive director and also in recovery?
yeah. I mean, I deal with this all the time where, we'll hire clinicians that are 26 years old who get a master's degree, and then they come out and they think everything is cookie cutter and like, this is how you work with someone, and then you do this and then you do this. And it's not touching anything, it's not touching anything of the real wound of why this is happening, to this idea that behind the behavior of addiction, there is an image. And the work really needs to become, this would be a real Hillman piece of it, but the work
Yeah.
really needs to become identifying the images behind the behavior of addiction. The images of dissent, the images of rupture, the images of longing and exile. And these are the things that then need to kind of be amplified in the individual's experience and revisioned into their mythos. And
Yeah.
if they can do that, and that doesn't happen in 4 weeks, doesn't happen in 6 weeks, that's a real down and dirty process. But when that happens, we have seen, especially at Rockland, lasting recovery, but also recovery that looks totally different. These are people that pursue the 12-step process, but understand it as a practice simply of grounding and a way to kind of organize and hold their suffering for a period of time, but not live there. And I think that's a big piece of where recovery is going in the future, where the industry needs to go in the future. AA and that 12-step model is great for that grounding experience, but it's not a place to live in. And I think that's been the dominant mode of thinking for a lot of people in the addiction space.
Well, and one of the things that I think is, well, I'm trying to think of how I want to like set that question up, but I'll just give you 3 pieces of something and then see how you want to fit them together. One of the things is I get a lot of calls of a certain type, and I'll say, when I get somebody who's saying that they're having a dissociative disorder that is just flaring up all of a sudden, and they don't know why, and they're starting to drink alcohol more, they're starting to have some kind of symptom more, is y'all ask like, what age are your kids? Because and they're like, what? I'm like, what happened to you when you were that age? Because so much of the time it's like, if I'm a woman and I have a sexual assault or an abuse, and then at 7, and then my child is right about to be 7, especially if the child's female, your body starts to almost give you that thing to start to understand in order to protect your child. I see that happen a lot. One of the things that happens with addiction, I think, is people are like, man, everything's going good. Like, I'm going to church. I've got this nonprofit. I'm doing this. I'm doing this. I'm doing this. But I'm like feeling this overwhelming whatever. And, it was an alcoholic, or I used, IV drugs, but I've been in recovery and that's good and whatever. And I always am like, how long have you been in? Was it about 3 years? Because it seems like that 3-year mark is where, all of the technique and the skill and the cognitive parts of like how not to use drugs or how not to participate in the behavior that you're in recovery from are there and established. But then all of a sudden there's this, the original problem that put you there is back, but you don't really want to go back to your old solution. But all of a sudden the problem is a problem and you're trying to deal with it. And that's like where the real trauma work can start, where like brain spotting and a Jungian lens of the soul is like such a helpful thing. And so that I love getting those phone calls because I know that person's just so ready, Could you say anything about that?
Definitely. I mean, I think that is so accurate. It's funny. It's so funny because I usually think that it's around like this 4 to 6 year mark that really starts to happen for people. So, and I talk about that, and that happened in my experience. Like I believe that the 12 steps it's a mythology, and mythology can be thought of as a psychic container. You know what I mean? It holds our suffering. It gives our suffering context. It gives my suffering language. It gives my suffering ritual. And that's what being in AA does. And so for that 3-year period of being in AA, that 4-year period, everything is able to be held within that mythology. And then that exact thing happens where you kind of take a step back, and the formulaic aspect of what you've been doing and the rigidity of what you've been doing, it starts to confine, and something in you is trying to grow beyond that. And we don't have places for those people to go that don't want to return to use, but also can admit that what they've been doing really isn't working anymore. And a lot of times, like especially in the 12-step community, it's kind of met with dismissal, like, oh, you're overthinking it, well, maybe your ego's getting in the way, or, oh, you're going to heading towards a relapse. And how frustrating is that? Because for someone who's done, quote unquote, done the work and changed behaviors and changed thought patterns and, going through all of this stuff, they're simply saying, I can't identify with that mythology anymore. And so I need to find the next container. And, the work that I've been doing, I really categorize this period of recovery as post-recovery work. It's not walking away from recovery, but it's changing the way we understand it. To your point, it's moving away from formula and rigidness, and it's moving into more of trying to deeply understand the roots of the problem in the first place. Now that I've had some time away and I've stabilized, I can do that work. And I've had this experience where a lot of friends of mine will go 5, 6, 7 years, and then all of a sudden they're out and they're relapsing, and you ask them what happened, and a lot of them said they felt this way, but they couldn't speak to it. They didn't feel like they had someone who was going to be there to hold that, because it was going to be met with some sort of aspect of or experience of that dismissal.
And what's frustrating is a lot of those people are not saying they want to relapse. They're not having any kind of desire for that. And it's almost like the community pushes them that way because they need to interpret everything as this need to use again, And so that becomes the language that they're almost offering somebody. And I think, the fusion of 12-step and the Jungian thing, it's not either or. It's, making a bigger container, and every epoch, every cultural cycle, we have to do that because the culture is different, the addiction is different, the drugs are different, the cultural factors that make up the human psyche and the waters we're swimming in are different. So of course, these methods have to change. And the idea that, well, this was randomized controlled trial, so it's 100%. If you do this, you have the best odds. I don't really believe that is a dynamic of a model of research and clinical practices as we need.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just the same thing. I mean, I think about Hillman's book a lot. We've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world is getting worse. And, I think about that in relation to AA sometimes. I wouldn't say that it's getting worse, but we've had 100 years of AA almost. Like, where are we going now? And is it still meeting the times? And to your point, like its language works for what it works for, but then it starts to fall short. And again, to your point, how many people have we lost trying to fit themselves into that container once they outgrew it?
Yeah.
And that's a bad thing to think about.
Yeah, and I think outgrowing it doesn't mean that you can drink or use drugs, occasionally, or I mean, it doesn't have to mean what a lot of the people who are scared by this kind of thing means. It means
Yeah,
that the soul continues to grow,
exactly.
and a lot of times there's no plan to ever use again. It's not a good idea to ever go back to partial recreational use of anything. That isn't
Yeah,
the distinction. It is that there is a bigger model where we can continue to have containers for people that are further and further along. And you've written a
yeah,
lot about James Hillman, who was I guess he was a Jungian analyst, even though he got driven out of Zurich with fire and later said, "I'm not an analyst. I'm not a clinical psychologist," when he was being fired in Texas. So I don't know what to call him. But he was an interesting guy. He was a good writer. Can you talk about how Hillman's kind of imaginal or archetypal psychology informs some of what you do, or just his ideas?
yeah, definitely. And real quick, I just want to say to that other point, I think part of the goal of recovery is to have that growth experience. It is to move on eventually and not stay put. So, just to end that question, Hillman, to me, is kind of like my psychological forefather. It's really wild. I stumbled upon his work for the first time probably in around 2017 or so. I picked up the Soul's Code. I really wasn't in a place to read it. You know how that happens with books. Your psyche picks it up, but it's not really the right time. And it wasn't until probably more closer to COVID and the 2020 timeframe where I had downloaded the volume of his biography, that the first one by Dick Russell, and I walked around my apartment complex every day listening to it. And the more and more I listened to it, it's just so much related to my experience within the recovery collective. Like he kind of came into the Jungian world, and then as he progressed through it, he kind of found the same juncture that we're speaking of. This is the old way and it's kind of cracking, and what's going to come next. I think that Hillman opens so many doors for people in this current climate. I think he was a man ahead of his time, and I think his time is coming, and his time is probably, now in some fashion, because again, we're hungry for new perspectives and new ways to think. And the way that he talks about returning soul to psychology and soul as a perspective, soul as something you can kind of embody, not some sort of thing that you have. It's a
And
way of
psyche
seeing.
and soul being different. John Beebe would point out about Hellman too, that they're not the same thing,
Yeah.
even though there may be some overlap.
Yeah. And so, for me, I think bringing some of Hillman's ideas into the addiction space started for me. It's kind of funny, like, in Revisioning Psychology, he has this chapter about, basically this process of seeing through something into its archetypal roots. And that's kind of what happened. His work led me to look deeper through the recovery experience. And beyond that, kind of, again, try to conceptualize this next phase of what recovery is for people when they outgrow that initial container. And it's helped me to sort of bring mythopoetics into the addiction space and allow people to understand the addiction process as initiation, but also as a living myth for them. It's part of their story. And, do this with introducing certain stories like Prometheus or Persephone and Tantalus. And again, just finding these new containers for people to conceptualize their suffering through beyond a clinical model or some sort of research,
Yeah.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
Hillman is an interesting figure to me, and because he's one that I couldn't get away from, like I kept bumping up against. A lot of
Mm,
him, I think, is uh, not quite finished. Like a lot of the things that he puts out as finished works, he was more in the process of something than he was willing to admit.
mhm.
I've talked to Dick Russell on here, his biographer. Hopefully, we're going to talk to him again later this year when his next book is coming out. I've talked to David Tacey, who is an analyst and a
Sure.
student of Hellman. He's an admirer of a lot of his work and
Yeah.
also a critic of a lot of his work.
Big critic. Yeah. Yeah.
I've talked to Lawrence Hillman, who is James Hillman's son,
Yeah.
and also working in astrology and psychology. and industrial organizational psychology too. And he was somebody who I kept seeing my own worst angels in, like the part of myself that I was kind of afraid of,
Mm,
because I think that there was a element of Hillman that was kind of driven mad, a madness he mastered later in life, but by his ability to see through time beyond his own life,
sure.
and the inability for his whole life to contain the expansiveness. We all kind of hit that, and that the reason that I mention that is not to opine on Hillman a ton, but I think a ton of recovery work that is embodying, that is soulful, that is good, is helping people come to terms with these frustrating and impossible limitations of life that are human, the body,
Mm,
the
mhm,
temporal thing that we have to sit through. I'm thinking of Simone Weil, the mystic, says, well, you should approach an addict like somebody who is trying to eat God. That
mhm,
this person is, sort of trying to contain all of it in a way that isn't possible, and to really reconnect and know that it's not a taking in, it's an emptying yourself of,
mm.
to really make room for something else. Could you say anything about that, or I mean, that's kind of a very open statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree that Hillman had this way of seeing through the events in his life that made his grounded life, his literal life, a little chaotic for sure. And I think that in my experience, it really opened up not necessarily kind of my darker sides of my life, but Hillman really opened me up to see how expansive my life could be, or how expansive I was as an individual. And coming from such a kind of structured recovery experience and world, that was really freeing to me.
Mhm.
Um, but I agree in the sense that it's hard to start with something like that, that someone who's looking to get sober, really coming off the streets or right off of a run, it's really hard to grasp any of this imaginal, sort of deeper rooted
Mhm.
material. Um, but I think what's really important that I do with people in the early stages with them in relation to Hillman is really trying to kind of talk about the idea of pathology, and this idea that, we psychopathologize everything. Like, I've listened to some of your episodes where you guys talked about evidence-based research, and it's just, we psychopathologize everything. And I had this instance with my son who, one day was just kind of pulling at his ears a lot,
Mhm.
I was with someone and they said something, and I said, well, maybe he's just going to be a musician. Maybe
Mhm.
there's something like peculiar about the way he's listening. And we don't
The
need to say,
rhythm of it, yeah.
yeah, we don't need to say that there's something wrong, but we need to try and honor this thing that's happening. And I talk about that with like people's experience of depression a lot. If you when you experience depression from a Hillman's perspective, I would say if you kind of work with it a little bit and embody the depression a little bit, you realize certain things. Like when you're depressed, you watch different movies, you eat different food, you listen to different music,
Mhm.
and you might dress differently. And through that experience with depression, you're able to gain a perspective through that lens that you weren't able to gain through your ego's perspective prior. And in that way, the depression is actually a gift. It's actually, the soul trying to tell you something. And if you break down that word, psyche logos, psychopathology, or psyche pathos, that is the love of the soul. And
Yeah.
so, a symptom like depression is the soul's way of loving us into seeing something about our lives that we cannot see from
Yeah.
ego consciousness.
Yeah.
And that, understanding that is very freeing from this idea that there's something wrong with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that is so important for people to understand. And that's why I think Hillman's time is sort of coming, because I think people are ready for something like that versus this idea that I'm sick and I need to get on this medication and I need to do this for the rest of my life.
Yeah, and also I think seeing a static end goal as this place that we get to is always gonna let you down. I mean,
Yeah,
another issue I have with the biomedical model is that, like you're saying, it turns every symptom into a problem, or into a, not even a problem as much as a finite thing. And I
yeah,
think that you should get under it and see it as a dynamic force that
yeah,
is sometimes good, sometimes bad, but always you, and a part of yourself that you can learn to hold. And that
yep,
when we turn things into an objective metric, like, we can look at a white cell blood count in a hard science like biology, but we can't really do that with psychology like a lot of the people that want to turn us into a computer, or just an inevitable result of computational genes are trying to do.
Mm.
We need to be able to see these things as the soul speaking, the soul crying out, as dimension. You don't even have to kind of do transdimensional forces, but just dynamic forces that need to be understood,
Sure.
and ultimately can probably only be understood by the person who is the one having the soul that is an analysis.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think that to that point, there is a rhythm to suffering, and I think that's such a thing that I talk about with people in recovery, which is this idea that you're in this process now and you're sober and you're helping other people and you're showing up. It by no means means that you're not going to suffer. Like, heartbreak is going to happen, relationships are going to end, jobs are going to end, and it kind of follows this rhythm of Persephone. The idea is you're always going to return to the underworld, and we're all going to return to the underworld, and we need to learn how to move through the underworld without grasping for the fruits. And the fruits for people in recovery or drug addicts are, relief and comfort and all these things. So we need to learn how to maneuver the underworld in a participatory way, not in a defensive way. And
Absolutely.
I think that's another thing that Hillman really brought out in me that changed my life, which was I need to participate with my emotions, not defend myself against them.
Yeah.
And that really opened up a whole world for me.
Yeah, have you read all 3 volumes of Hillman's biography?
Yeah.
I haven't read
Kind
them
of
all.
like psychotically, yeah.
Yeah. So, Dick Russell, when I interviewed him, it wasn't out yet, he said that there was kind of a forgiveness of Jung when Hillman found the Red Book, and that a lot of the anger that he had, he kind of let go of, because he saw that as this descent and return that he was wanting psychology to have, and he saw that Jung had done that himself to kind of have the framework that he later built. He just didn't think that the kind of archetypal realm that he was descending into with the Red Book was something everyone needed to do. It was something he wanted to glean insights from, and then inform his writing. But Jung had this idea of descent and return, which Campbell takes and makes the hero's journey for pop psychology and screenwriters. But there's this idea of like, that you go down into this place that is the descent into hell, or the descent into the underworld, or ultimately the parts of yourself you don't understand, and then you come back. But that you do that enough that the ego kind of becomes porous to where it's unafraid of it, and it's
Right.
not a rigid boundary that just cracks and becomes psychotic, or just needs to crack and dissociate, or crack and or lose itself in addiction, but that it becomes this porous boundary, like a cell wall that can let unconscious contents in. But
Hmm.
it's still a filter. It's still there. We have to have that individual identity. We have to have that ability to turn off a lot of ourself, because we can't just be this expansive ball of energy of all we are.
Yeah.
Could you say some about maybe that reforming the process? Because I think the biggest risk I see when somebody is telling me that they've finished with addiction work or something is that they view it as a destination where they're done and they used to feel this way and they won't feel that again. And it's no, on a certain level, you'll always feel that way. It's being
Yeah.
able to go down and descend into that and then learn something from it without using, and without ultimately doing anything that is turning you off or being destructive.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I meant with the example of depression. It takes a period of time before you can participate with something like that in that manner. And I think that's really the process of that initial period of recovery. It's helping the ego gain enough strength to be able to do something like that. And I think that's an immensely important piece of the work. People who are jumping into the descent or archetypal or Jungian work too soon, they risk they risk that idea that the ego isn't strong enough to hold the contents that they meet or that arise. But I think, to your point, that's what I meant with the idea of depression. We have to go into it and not be afraid of it, and kind of see that the more and more I have that experience, like one of the ways I think about it with metaphorically is, when I assign to depression that it's mine, it gets
Mhm.
sort of trapped in the body, and that's when we experience what I think collectively we understand as depression. When this phenomena arises and it comes to me, for whatever reason, if I immediately trap it and I say, well, my depression has gotten really bad, I can't come to work today, it actually exasperates the experience of depression.
Yeah.
If the phenomena comes to me and I realize this is something visiting, there's a purpose for this happening, and I work with it for a little bit, and I do some writing, and maybe I, like I said, watch some movies or eat different food or whatever, dress differently or listen to different music, and I get to some resolve of what the depression was trying to get me to see, the phenomena, I feel like, leaves. And then I find myself, all right, I'm okay again. I came out of that. I've risen up again from this experience. And now the next time it comes, I have to do the same thing because it's going to come again. And it coming again does not mean failure, and it doesn't mean regression. And it just means, it honestly, it just means we're human. It just means we're alive. That these phenomena, these psychic phenomena that you can't see, that you can't grasp, they come when they're ready. And, like Hillman's point, behind every symptom, there is a God almost. So what God is coming to me right now, and why?
So the question that people always direct at the Jungians, to start to put a head on some of this stuff is technique. You're talking about a map, you're talking about a process, you're talking about throwing the baby out with the bathwater of research and clinical psychology and the biomedical model. What do you want to do? What does recovery look like? Because I think for most people that have your perspective, the actual 12-step model doesn't really need to change that much. It just needs to prepare for where we're not white knuckling it through the early stages of not using, and kind of point towards another doorway. What does that door look like, and what's on the other side, and how do we build that? How do we do that? How do you do that through your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big pieces about that is like, I kind of feel like Hillman would call it the aesthetic response. It's part of it is starting to have these little moments where you try to find the beauty in what's right in front of you and appreciate what's in front of you and see it as alive. So you start to take more concern about the way you keep your home. You start to take more concern about the way you decorate your office. You start to take more concern about the way you're eating and the food you're eating, and you try to see beauty in it, and you try to see it as psyche, kind of his idea of anima mundi, and this idea that everything we're doing is affecting us psychologically. I love what he says about office spaces. If you go into your office and it's bright fluorescent lights and there's nothing on the walls and it's all white, there's no healing that's going to happen there. Or even when he talks about, working with a married couple, he would say, let's not even talk about your marriage, but tell me how you decorate the living room. And if there's just trash everywhere and everything is chaotic, then that's affecting you just as much. So I think part of what we need to do in recovery is return to some aesthetic appreciation of being able to see the beauty in the world, and that, it's affecting us just as much as we're affecting it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the fluorescent lighting. I one of the first episodes I talked to the architect Leon Creer about new urbanism, his work with new urbanism. And at the time, I didn't even know that was going to be a podcast, and was kind of, or that I would do one. And I was kind of wrestling with Hillman because there were parts of him that I really liked, and there were parts of him that kind of scared me about myself. And Creer, off mic, like at our conversation at the end, was like, "Oh yeah, you remind me of this guy that I met in Zurich when you're talking about that," because he didn't know Jung, but I was probably said a Jungian idea or something. He's like, "James Hillman," and I was like, "Oh shit." And he was like, "Yeah, he told me that American architecture, like European architecture, draws the eye upward. Everything is pulling you up because it wants you to contemplate God. But Americans come in and they put a drop ceiling and fluorescent lighting because capitalism needs you to stare down into hell."
That's why.
So I don't think Hillman ever wrote that, or at least have never seen a recording of him saying that, but he did tell it to Creer in Zurich at one point.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. But I do think that's so much of it, right? Like Hillman would say too, that recovery, I think Hillman would say recovery is so immensely bound in monotheism and in the perspective of Christianity. And it really is from the 12-step perspective, And the idea is all about, kind of transcending. I transcend resentment, I transcend behaviors, and I get above that, and I don't act like that anymore, and I reach purity. And that's just, I think, to the point we were talking about earlier, that sort of perspective or that sort of myth doesn't hold for forever. And we need to prepare people for the fall of that, and the ability to kind of go down and hold things soulfully and hold things from a sort of perspective of depth versus transcendence.
Well, and even somebody like Hillman, who was just obsessed with bringing back a polytheism into psychology and wanted a return to the Greek mystery cults and getting away from monotheism, I don't think he saw monotheism or a singular self as a problem. He saw them as containers, and that
Mhm.
sometimes you need this type of container at different points of the journey, and other times you need this type of container, and that there
Right.
were places where that top down traditional hierarchy, putting God into one box instead of lots of little boxes,
Mm.
or the divine, the self, into one box instead of lots of little boxes, was not allowing for a greater ritual to happen. Like, and if
Yeah.
you go and you look at, there's lots of places where I think Edward Edinger puts Jung better than Jung puts himself, because
Sure.
Jung wasn't quite settled with what he was trying to say. I mean, Hillman's the same, where it's like he kind of opened up a conversation where there's some things where I don't know that he ever said them perfectly by the end of his life, or at least not, in a book. Maybe he was saying that to somebody else. But if you look at the through lines and what he's calling to come back into recovery, to come back into psychology, I think are an animism and a sense
Mhm.
of ritual. An
Yep.
animism in that I can turn my own ego down enough to hear the world talk to me, to let my
Yep.
house be alive, to let the sword that I'm making be alive. That
Yep.
you're turning down your own identity enough to hear the identity of the world and re-ensouling that. In a way, you're never going to get there through an objective science that's going to say this is the reason why you don't light the planet on fire. This is the reason why BlackRock and hedge funds are probably the wrong path.
Yeah.
Because a spreadsheet can't do that in a way that a re-ensoulment of the world through animism can.
Yeah.
Same
I
thing with
think.
ritual.
Yeah.
He
I
wanted.
think. I think that's interesting. Like, I don't mean to interrupt, but it was making me
No,
think.
please.
Are you familiar with the work of Robert Sardello?
Yeah, I've encountered him a little bit.
So, that's sort of really Robert Sardello's practices and some of his sort of contemplative work was really the segue for me into that ability to experience that sort of animism again, and this idea of getting out of that top down response from a phenomenological perspective and
Mhm.
basis. And you know it's funny that they did a lot of work together when they were in Dallas at the Dallas Institute for Humanities, and a lot of, to your point about Edinger and Jung, a lot of what Sardello is doing is sort of taking Hillman and putting it in a more kind of structured context, a
Yeah.
more maybe, I don't know about academic, but more refined um, way almost.
He definitely
And,
was going to play politics with institutions way more than Hillman ever was going to.
yeah, yeah,
Hillman
yeah.
was not going to carry any water for anything that he didn't have complete respect for,
And
down
I
to the
think
root.
too, I think too with Hillman, like the idea of what you said about the self, I don't think he was against the self. I think he was against the Jungian community making the self this goal to reach through analysis. Like, you go into analysis, you individuate, and you reach the self. And that's, Edinger's sort of, ego self access. And that,
Yeah.
I think, makes a lot of sense. But again, to that experience of rhythm, I just think you come in and out of that. You
Yeah. Yeah.
experience the self, and then you move around and you mess up, and then you come back and you work with the self. And that's sort of more spiralic way of being in the world is much more, I feel like, how Hillman honored the self versus those traditional Jungians as sort of like this end game, you know?
He definitely hated the literalism of the institutes that just takes over in the 80s. And I think probably rightly so. I mean, the people that I like left the institutes at that point to pursue an experiential and a somatic medicine, like Arnie Mindell with process therapy, or Sidra Halstone with voice dialogue, which in some
Oh,
ways
yeah.
is a more intuitive form of IFS, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that Hillman's experience, again, like we were saying at the beginning, kind of his experience in Zurich really mimics what we're saying about the recovery experience, like, and it kind of comes up against too, like, with Hillman, the Puer Senex work is so vast, and it's such an
mhm.
intricate part of his thinking. And that's sort of what we're up against, like when the Senex becomes too one-sided in this rigid, formulaic, repetitious approach to recovery, it breeds that puer shadow that needs to kind of just run out and jump out the window, or, kind of
Yeah.
jump up and scream, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to go find something now.
Yeah.
And we need to honor that impulsivity as creative energy that the Senex has kind of been pressing down,
Mhm.
and that was what he was up against in that period of time when he was sort of director of studies and trying to bring these new things to the Institute. Like, what's that story in the first volume about playing softball? Like he started bringing baseball gloves and
Mhm.
softball, and he would, say, and this was so crazy, he would say that, they would have better discussions there than in any sort of lecture hall. And then I was in Chicago
Mm.
at a weekend teaching with an analyst named Dennis Merritt. And one of
Mm.
the first things he said was, I was in there in the 70s and we would play softball with James Hillman. And the way he
Mhm.
was just like, that's what he remembered from 1970, playing
Yeah.
softball. And to Hillman's point, he would say that in that softball, Eros was there. And from that Platonic standpoint, you need Eros to teach anything. And so how can we look at that in the 12 steps? Is I would say that AA has lost its level of Eros. There's not enough anymore. And so the teachings start to lack.
Yeah.
The communities start to become hierarchical. They start to become, well, that's that guy. He sponsors all these people, or this is the old timer who's been here for 20 years. Let's listen to him. They don't have that experience of Eros anymore. And I think that's what, at his best, he was trying to bring out and show people. And, I think it kind of backfired on him in a couple of ways. But
Well, when you're having an affair with a patient, you might have too much eros in your psychoanalysis. Hillman was
yeah,
not a perfect guy. I mean, it
yeah,
also the ethics was not modern. There were a lot of. It wasn't like he's doing that today, but
yeah,
there were a
yeah.
lot of things that are pretty wild in his biography. And
Oh,
in
yeah.
his life. And I think
Yeah.
he would be the first one to tell you that.
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
yeah, I wonder, we talk about animism being, the re-enchantment of the world, but to me, ritual is where you willfully and intentionally take parts of yourself that you want to change, externally, you externalize them.
mm,
In Western esoteric magic, that maybe is through, burying a duck egg or putting these little figures on a board. But in art therapy, it's through art. In hypnosis, it's through, or guided meditation, it's through turning these pieces of you into an image.
mm,
And then the
mm,
important part of the ritual is modifying this image externally so that you have more power over those pieces of self and then reclaiming them. And I
mm,
think that ritual and animism are two of the things that Hillman wanted to come back. A lot of his take on a polytheistic
yeah.
psychology is trying to do that. Could you say anything about those things in your work, or how they show up, how you kind of use them, if you do at all?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say specifically. I'm trying to think if we, I mean, with animism, I think I try and work with people, especially from not necessarily a external standpoint, but as far as internal phenomena, always trying to understand what's happening to them as something that's alive.
Hmm.
So again, putting a face to the experience of depression, putting an image to the experience of addiction, and letting it sort of amplify itself into something bigger. I think that, to your point about ritual, man, we've lost it, and that's sort of the experience that I feel like people come up against again in the recovery space, which is the rituals. There's a famous quote, I forget by who, but it's, the rituals remain long after the reason is remembered, or long after the
Yeah.
reason is forgotten.
Yeah.
So we just keep doing these things, but they almost feel empty.
Ritual
You
can
know?
be good and it can be bad, and just like
Yeah,
religion, when it's not alive anymore, just like routine or tradition, or there are 12-step programs, I think, that are alive, that understand the concepts you're talking about. I mean,
yeah.
sometimes I tell people who think a certain way, I want you to go to this church on this day, because
Hmm.
that's where you're going to find your people. Whereas if you go at 3 o'clock, I don't know that you will.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think part of that is trying to push people to seek out ritual and to
Mhm.
understand the importance of ritual in their life, and then let them create it. I think that's part of the problem is people need to find space to develop their own rituals and find and attach meaning to them instead of being told this is the ritual you need to do. I think that works for a period, but really what we long for is a personal relationship to the way we move through life. And, the rituals that speak to, say, my daemon might not speak to someone else's. And so a lot of the work, I think, that recovery in its next, evolution will be about is helping people develop their own rituals versus putting them into old rituals, no longer working.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's beautiful. Is there anything that you want to say to wrap up? I want to be respectful of your time and not take you, over your lunch break. What all is anything that we don't touch on you feel like is important for or we have enough there to go ahead and release this on the internet and trust that people will reinsole the world without any
Yeah, I
more.
mean, I think what's important is we kind of said it all throughout is we're not saying anything bad about 12 steps or traditional recovery in that way. We're just saying that inevitably it does lack, and what we need to find is where people can go in that moment or experience of lack instead of pushing back on them to do more work or putting them in a position where they feel like they're failing because something is awakening in them and arising in them. And
And
I
it is
think
not always the desire to use. Even if you tell them that, they may mistake it for it. But a lot of times it is dying of old things and a hunger for a new thing that we can't yet see.
it's just it's the next initiation. It's the next moment in that person's development and then in that person's becoming. And I think that's the most important thing to think about in the evolution of what's coming is that how do we hold space for that experience?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank
Yeah.
you. That's beautiful. If people want to find out more about what you do, I can include any link in the show notes. But what would you like them to check out? An article, a book, your business on LinkedIn. What would be a good thing?
Yeah, they can definitely check out the LinkedIn profile, and from there, they can check out, my website is depthrecovery.org, and it sort of introduces Hillman to the recovery space, Jung to the recovery space, and has a bunch of writing and, some general ideas of a different approach to this issue.
Well, thank you. That's gorgeous. I will link to the LinkedIn page, and then from there you can check out some of Corey's other stuff. Thank you so much for getting on with us today.
All right, thanks, Joel.
Hey guys, this is Joel, and I wanted to pop in to remind you that we do this podcast for free, which there are a lot of expenses associated with. One of the things that could help you and also would help us is if you would learn about one of our sponsors, Hardy Nutritionals. I'm not a big fan of a lot of the BS in the wellness space. Hardy has randomized controlled trials on all of its products that they paid to be conducted by external researchers who found a lot of validity in what they do. One of the things that I like about Hardy is that they do double-blind randomized controlled trials, which is the gold standard of research, and they've shown that on top of a lot of health benefits, that mental health is improved, and that especially in children with autism and ADHD, mood, anxiety, and symptoms of irritability were reduced, which is one of the things that traditional medication doesn't affect and often causes in order to enhance focus. So if you would go to gethardy.com, that's GETHARDY.com, and use offer code TAPROOT, you'll get 15% off. There's also lots of information about all the ingredients and how they work on our website, gettherapybirmingham.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to one of their wellness advisors. Hardy realized that the people who try their product, like myself, that weren't expecting much, realize that it does make a significant difference, and they stay on it for the rest of their life, most of the time. So if you head to the website, you can schedule with a wellness advisor and get a customized plan made with a professional that Hardy pays for absolutely free. I hope it works for you, and if you have any questions, reach out.